The day a man starts getting rich rarely feels dramatic. It does not feel like a jackpot. It does not feel like a promotion dinner with everyone smiling a little too hard. It does not feel like the moment he buys the car he used to slow down for at stoplights. It does not even feel at first like success. More often, it feels like restraint. It feels like saying no and not explaining yourself. It feels like not upgrading something that everyone around you assumes you will upgrade. It feels like putting money somewhere invisible instead of turning it into a visible object. It feels quiet. That is one reason so many people miss it when it first begins. They have been trained to think wealth is loud. A larger house, a better zip code, a kitchen that photographs well, a bigger vacation, nicer luggage, the right watch. The kind of confidence that can be mistaken for peace by people standing outside the life and looking in through the glass. I have lived long enough to know that what looks rich and what feels rich are often entirely different conditions. The first one is easy to stage. The second one takes structure. And structure is boring enough that almost nobody gives it enough respect until life punishes them for that mistake. I want to tell you something plainly. The first real sign that you are becoming wealthy is not that your life gets flashier. It is that your life gets quieter. Money begins taking up less space in your thoughts. Not because you are careless, because you finally built enough order that money no longer has to shout to be heard. When people are poor or simply financially disorganized, money becomes the lead actor in every scene. Lunch becomes a financial decision. A flat tire becomes a mood. A doctor visit becomes a week. Long argument, a broken phone charger becomes a tiny insult added to an already full emotional bill. That is how most people live. Not because they are stupid, because they built no buffer between themselves and ordinary life. And when there is no buffer, every ordinary problem arrives like an emergency. I have always thought that was one of the saddest features of modern adulthood. People work hard, very hard, and then they build a financial life so brittle that one small disturbance can ruin the emotional climate of an entire month. That is not wealth, no matter what the car looks like in the driveway. Wealth begins when ordinary disruptions stop owning your nervous system. That is the threshold. You may not feel rich at all when you cross it. In fact, most people who cross it still think of themselves as careful, practical, and perhaps a little behind. That is fine. The market does not reward you for feeling rich. It rewards you for behaving in ways that make future strength more likely. And because the reward is delayed, the behavior often looks unimpressive in the present. That is another truth the world does not teach very well. The things that make you rich in 10 years often make you look boring today. I knew a man years ago who made a good income and spent less than almost everyone who knew his salary thought he should. He drove an older Toyota, not a wreck, just old enough that other men used it as silent evidence that he had somehow failed to arrive. He and his wife lived in an apartment 2 neighborhoods below what their income could have justified. Not a bad apartment, just not one that told a flattering story. He wore practical shoes, booked flights early, asked good questions before signing things, brought lunch more often than he bought it. He was not cheap. That is an important distinction. Cheap people usually create misery around them. He created margin, and because he created margin, something happened that the louder people around him never really noticed. He stopped being easy to frighten. That is what money is for at its highest use. Not status, not applause, not proving to a cousin from high school that you did not waste your potential. Money is stored calm, stored choice, stored time, stored negotiating power. A man with margin speaks differently, walks differently, sleeps differently, not because he has become spiritually superior, because he no longer has to sell every hour of his future at the first available price. That is why I care so much about the quiet signs. The public usually notices the loud signs last and admires them too much. I prefer the quiet signs because they say more about what is actually happening underneath. The first quiet sign is that you begin living below your means without feeling deprived. That sentence sounds simple. It is not. Most people here live below your means and imagine punishment, coupons, cold rooms, no dinners out, a life arranged around denial. That is not what I mean. I mean, your spending starts becoming intentional enough that income and lifestyle are no longer racing each other upward. There is a gap, a real one, not a fantasy gap that exists only if no emergencies happen. A monthly surplus that appears with enough regularity that your future can begin making claims on the present. That gap is where wealth begins, not where you finally feel well off. Not where the salary headline crosses some number strangers online told you matters. The gap rich people with no gap are often just high earners on a delay. Modest earners with a meaningful gap are often much closer to real strength than anyone realizes. This is one reason I never cared much for income by itself as a measure of financial intelligence. Income matters, of course, more is better than less, other things equal. But the transformation in a household does not begin when income rises. It begins when the household stops spending all available oxygen. I have seen people earning $75,000 quietly build more future than people earning $125,000 because the first household had a gap and the second had only habits. That gap becomes reserves, then ownership, then options, then time. All the good things begin there. And because the gap does not photograph well, people underestimate its importance. A person who has mastered living below his means often does not feel rich. He feels ordinary. That is exactly why he is winning. The second quiet sign is that you start thinking in decades instead of weekends. This is harder than it sounds because modern life trains the mind toward immediacy. The next check, the next bonus, the next refund, the next hot stock, the next side hustle, the next little rush of progress. All of this creates a life that is constantly moving and rarely compounding. Compounding demands a different temperament. It asks you to respect what is slow and cumulative instead of only what is visible and immediate. A lot of people cannot do that. They mistake patience for passivity. They confuse speed with intelligence. They keep interrupting the machine because the machine is not flattering them fast enough. The person who begins to get rich quietly does something different. He stops demanding excitement from his capital. He starts asking what repeated ordinary behavior will look like in 10 or 20 years. He buys the broad index fund, keeps buying when the market is ugly, keeps buying when the market is boring, keeps buying when everyone around him is pretending that crypto or options or some private little opportunity is the more intelligent path because it sounds more alive. That is one of the great paradoxes of wealth. What makes people rich often feels too plain to be respected by people who need entertainment from their money. I have never needed entertainment from my money. I want money to work. That is a different standard. A man who starts thinking in decades becomes much less vulnerable to whatever noise happens to dominate the week, and that immunity is worth a great deal. The third quiet sign is that you build a financial buffer and stop talking about it. The world has a peculiar relationship with visible wealth. It loves display. People will happily finance an expensive car to create the appearance of abundance and then quietly carry a checking account balance that would not survive a dental problem and a car repair in the same month. That is not unusual. It is practically a national habit buffer. On the other hand, is invisible. An emergency fund does not pull into a parking lot. A high-yield savings account does not get likes on a social app. 3 or 6 or 9 months of core expenses sitting quietly in reserve looks like nothing from the street. That is what makes it so powerful. It exists for the owner, not the audience. I have long believed that one of the most valuable things money can buy is not luxury but reaction time. If your job disappears tomorrow, how many days can you still think clearly before fear begins making decisions for you? If the transmission fails, the deductible hits, the dog gets sick, and the HVAC unit dies in the same season. Does your life become a crisis or an inconvenience? That is what the buffer answers. And a great many people only discover its value by suffering its absence. A buffer changes your tone before it changes your net worth in any visible way. You stop scanning the bank balance before every ordinary purchase. You stop mentally assigning every upcoming bill a little background panic. You stop treating your credit card as a bridge between this week, life, and next week. Apology, that is a huge shift. Not because it looks wealthy, because it feels sane. The public talks about wealth as though it should first appear in consumption. In reality, it often first appears in the disappearance of low-grade fear. That is a much better signal. The fourth quiet sign is lifestyle inflation begins losing its power over you. This may be the most underappreciated turning point in personal finance. Most people are not destroyed by one reckless purchase. They are slowly captured by the assumption that every increase in income should be followed by some increase in visible living. A raise comes in, the apartment gets larger, then the car becomes nicer, then the grocery store changes, then the vacations become more expensive, then the subscriptions multiply, then all the small improvements become the new definition of normal. And the person wakes up one day making more money than ever and somehow feeling almost no stronger. That is lifestyle inflation. Not dramatic, not evil, just relentless. It is one of the main reasons people stay financially anxious, even while climbing professionally. The quietly rich person has a different response to rising income. He notices the raise. He appreciates it. Then a meaningful chunk of it disappears into savings, investing, debt reduction where appropriate, or reserve building before the upgraded self has time to claim it. That is a kind of immunity, not total immunity. I am not suggesting that life should never improve. Of course, life should improve. The point is that the improvement does not need to consume the full increase. The public has a dangerous habit of treating every raise as evidence that the old level of restraint can now be retired. Usually that is exactly backwards. A raise is often the first moment when real acceleration becomes possible, because now the savings gap can widen without creating lifestyle pain. If the person captures it, most do not. That is why so many people with strong salaries still live financially weak lives. They upgraded their present faster than they strengthened their future. The quietly rich do the reverse. The fifth quiet sign is that comparison starts losing its grip on you. I do not think this can be overstated. Comparison is one of the most expensive habits in the world because it creates a false urgency to buy proof. A friend gets a truck. A neighbor renovates the kitchen. A cousin takes the family to Italy. A coworker posts the beach resort, the watches, the polished countertops. The carefully lit evidence that life is working. Most people react. Even if they do not say it aloud, they react. Am I behind? Should I be doing more? Should my life look bigger by now? That is how a lot of financial trouble begins. Not with greed, exactly with status anxiety. The quietly rich person starts to lose interest in that game. He sees the truck and thinks, I hope he enjoys it. He sees the vacation and thinks, good for them. He sees the renovation and thinks maybe that matters to them more than it does to me. That emotional neutrality is worth a fortune because once comparison stops directing capital, money can finally be given tasks that matter to the actual owner instead of the imagined crowd. This is where values become useful financially. A person who knows what matters to him becomes much harder to market to, much harder to pressure, much harder to embarrass into spending. He does not need to reject every nice thing. He simply no longer confuses someone else's visible choice with an obligation to imitate. That is freedom. And it often arrives before the account balance looks impressive. The sixth quiet sign is that money stops being the main topic in your head. Poorly managed money consumes attention. Every lunch, every bill, every refill, every invitation gets dragged through the same tiring internal debate. Can I? Should I? What if? Maybe next week. This constant calculation is exhausting. It is one of the least discussed costs of weak financial structure. People think financial stress is only about numbers. It is also about bandwidth. A person can lose enormous mental energy, not because he is destitute, but because he has built no system, no automation, no reserve, no clear plan, no intentional allocations, no ownership engine, no calm. So money remains loud. The quietly rich person experiences a shift here. He does not necessarily talk about money less because he became uninterested in money. He talks about it less because the basic machinery is finally doing its job without needing constant supervision. The bills are on autopilot. The investments are on autopilot. The reserve exists. The rebalancing is occasional, not obsessive. The whole subject stops needing daily management. That is not a small victory. That is one of the major signs that wealth is becoming structural rather than situational. I have always thought boring money is usually superior money, not because boredom is noble, because systems that can run without your emotional participation are far more reliable than systems that require you to be your own central bank every Tuesday. The public wants to feel rich. The wise person wants money to become background infrastructure. Those are different ambitions. The seventh quiet sign is that you begin valuing time as if it were the scarce asset. That is one of the clearest signals that the internal relationship to wealth is maturing. Poor people often have no choice but to trade time directly for money in the most obvious sense. They work the hour, they live by the shift, they count the next payment. That is hard enough. What is more tragic is that many people keep living that way mentally even after they build enough financial strength to start buying time back. They still do everything themselves because paying for help feels indulgent. They still overpack the calendar because busyness feels important. They still say yes to pointless meetings, errands, tasks, and obligations because they never updated their sense of what money is for. Money used correctly buys time, it buys thinking space, it buys recovery, it buys the ability to say no to low value demands, it buys the right to stop treating exhaustion as a personality. This is one reason I think convenience spending gets misunderstood. There is foolish convenience and intelligent convenience, a person living on debt. Funded food delivery because he will not learn to cook is not buying time well. A person with a sound balance sheet paying for some help that frees hours for his children, his thinking, his health, or his best work may be allocating money intelligently. The question is not whether the spending is visible. The question is whether it actually buys back life that matters. The quietly rich person starts asking that question more often. He does not glorify busy. He does not treat an overfilled calendar like proof of relevance. He begins to notice when time is being stolen by things that money, structure, or discipline could solve. That is a sophisticated form of wealth even before the world would label it as such. The eighth quiet sign is that excuses begin losing their charm. This one matters because it changes the whole tone of a person's financial life. When people are broke, financially or emotionally, they often speak as if money is something happening to them. Rent is crazy. The economy is impossible. Taxes are ridiculous. My parents never taught me this. I never got the right break. I deserve to enjoy myself. All of those things may contain some truth. Truth alone does not build structure at a certain point. The quietly rich person stops centering the explanation and starts centering the response. He stops saying, "I cannot afford that." He says, "That is not a priority right now." He stops saying, "I need life to get easier before I begin." He says, "This is what I can control from where I stand." That shift in language is not cosmetic. Language reveals the operating system. Excuse language produces passive behavior. Ownership language produces design. A person does not need ideal conditions to start becoming stronger. He needs enough honesty to work with the actual conditions instead of performing frustration about them. I have known people who built quiet wealth in expensive cities on incomes that would not impress anyone online because they accepted the constraints and designed around them. Roommates, meal prep, used cars, intentional entertainment, automatic investing, no resentment, no drama, no fantasy about becoming wealthy by looking wealthy first. And I have known people with similar incomes who built nothing because they treated every constraint as proof that saving and investing could wait until the perfect phase of life arrived. Perfect phases rarely arrive. That is why ownership matters. Now, let me tell you about two men. Call the first one Richard. The second, Peter. Not because the names matter, because the difference does. At 30, both men made around $65,000 in a high-cost city. Neither was rich, neither was doomed. Richard took a roommate even after getting a raise because he wanted housing costs low enough that investing still felt easy. He used a paid-off used car and then eventually a bike for most local errands. He automated a monthly transfer into index funds. He kept a separate savings account growing slowly in the background. When friends upgraded apartments, he admired the pictures and did nothing. When the market fell, he kept contributing because the system had already been decided in advance. At 35, he earned more. He did not announce this by changing the visible shape of his life much. He announced it in silence. The portfolio got thicker, the reserve got stronger, the breathing room got wider. By 40, he had real money. Not mansion money, not yacht money, real money. The kind that changes how a person speaks to a boss, the kind that changes what a bad month can do. Peter earned roughly the same path of income. He was never a fool in the theatrical sense. He simply let the culture vote on every raise. The nicer apartment, the lease on the vehicle, the little luxuries that make a week feel earned and a decade feel weaker. He did not think of himself as irresponsible. That is what makes this so common. By 40, he still looked successful. more successful than Richard if an outsider judged only by surfaces. Inside the system, however, the difference was stark. Richard had assets, Peter had upgrades. Richard had a buffer, Peter had better stories. Richard had options, Peter had obligations. That is what I mean when I say the signs are quiet. The scoreboard the public uses is not the scoreboard that matters early. Now, because I am talking like an investor, let me say something blunt about broad market investing. One of the source themes in the document you uploaded is that quietly rich people tend to keep buying broad index funds, ignore the daily drama, and let compounding do its work over a long horizon. That is sound. Fay Filosite, Fay Turn 35 File, 8 Fay Turn 35 File, 12 Fay. I have recommended broad low-cost index funds for ordinary people for years, for a reason. The average investor does not need a heroic idea. He needs ownership, he needs a claim on productive businesses, he needs low cost, he needs time. He needs to keep his hands off the machine long enough that the machine can become visible. That is all. The quietly rich rarely look like geniuses in the beginning. They look repetitive. That is another reason the public misses them. Repetition is not glamorous. It is powerful. A person who invests $500 a month into broad productive assets for 20 years may not have much to say at dinner parties about winning. He may still quietly outbuild people with more exciting stories. That is how compounding works. It rewards what remains in place long enough to gather weight. It does not care what would have looked most impressive on a random Thursday night 5 years earlier. Another thing the quietly rich understand is that there is a difference between feeling broke and being fragile. A lot of high-income households feel broke because their spending keeps pace with income and their expectations keep pacing with their peer group. A modest income household with margin may feel less successful socially and still be far less fragile economically. That matters. Fragility is expensive. It turns every decision into a threat calculation. It narrows the mind. It destroys creativity. It makes a person much easier to manipulate because urgency is one of the world's most effective sales tools. The person with margin cannot be sold to as easily because he no longer needs every decision to prove something right now. That is another quiet sign. You stop being easy to hurry. Most bad purchases are urgency wearing a respectable disguise, limited time. Once in a lifetime you deserve this. Your peers are already here. The quietly rich person has enough internal strength to let the urgency pass through the room without owning him. That is a kind of wealth too. And because this is Buffett speaking, let me say what I always come back to. The purpose of money is not to create a prettier prison. The purpose of money is to create more freedom of action. The moment your financial choices begin reducing panic, reducing comparison, reducing noise, and reducing the number of foolish things you must tolerate, you are moving in the right direction. Even if your car is unimpressive, even if your vacation photos are sparse, even if nobody around you understands what you are building yet. In fact, not being understood is often part of the process. The quietly rich are usually misread for a long time. They are called too cautious, too plain, too practical, too stingy, too obsessed with the future. That criticism rarely ages well because time reveals what the flashy present often hides. One person's visible abundance was debt. Another person's boring restraint was freedom under construction. And time is excellent at exposing the difference. I do not want people to worship restraint for its own sake. That is another possible mistake. The point is not to become joyless. The point is to spend from a place of design instead of impulse. A rich life is not a small life. It is a deliberate life. Sometimes that includes travel, sometimes generosity, sometimes convenience, sometimes beauty. The difference is that those things are being purchased after the system is working, not instead of it. That is the whole distinction. A person who is quietly getting rich is not always denying himself. He is simply no longer using money to perform identity at the expense of future strength. That is why he may not feel rich at first. He is too busy redirecting the river. The lush field appears later. So if you want to know whether you are quietly getting rich, do not start by looking for luxury. Look for quieter clues. Do you consistently live below your means without resentment? Do you think in decades more often than in weekends? Have you built a real buffer? Do raises increase your investments more than your visible life? Do you compare less? Do you spend less time talking about money because the system now runs with less intervention? Do you value time more than display? Do you speak the language of ownership instead of excuses? Those are meaningful signs. They do not guarantee wealth overnight. Nothing does. They do mean something important, though. They mean your financial life is becoming structural instead of theatrical. And structural wealth is the only kind I trust. The world is full of theatrical wealth. The expensive lease, the funded vacation, the polished kitchen, financed at the cost of tomorrow. The public mistakes those things for the finish line. The finish line is much quieter. It sounds like sleep. It sounds like no. It sounds like not having to check your account before every ordinary decision. It sounds like having enough reserves that a bad month stays a bad month instead of becoming a bad year. It sounds like your children experiencing a calmer version of you. That may be the most valuable return of all. People think wealth changes what you own. It also changes how you arrive in a room. Less cornered, less loud, less eager to prove. That is what I would want for anyone listening. Not merely more money, more room. And if you have even one or two of these quiet signs already taking root in your life, then you are building something real. Whether the crowd notices yet or not, keep going. The crowd is usually late to the only wealth that really matters.